Our guest today is Siddharth Varadarajan, the founder editor of The Wire.in. Siddharth has been an old colleague at The Hindu, so he graduated from Columbia after having studied at the London School of Economics and then taught at New York University, then came to Delhi, became a journalist at the Times of India before moving to The Hindu, and then left and a year ago set up The Wire.in. So Siddharth, welcome. You're going to talk to two student journalists. In fact, you're here in the studio with a large studio audience, all student journalists, and the persons interviewing you today are Anushka Kelkar and Shranya Gamji Gambhir. Those are the names they're better known by. So there you go, girls. Shoot.
So Mr. Varadarajan, in the light of the NDTV ban, how free do you think our media is today in terms of censorship?
Okay. Well, I think the NDTV ban caught a lot of people off guard because the assumption was that whatever powers the government has to clamp down on media concern mainly the internet or social media, or concern far-flung corners of the country. For example, when Kashmiri paper was shut down, everybody, that took people by surprise too, because one had assumed the newspapers were in a way beyond government regulation in that way. But that paper was shut down. People took it in their stride. But then when NDTV was issued this ban order, it was not just the fact that the government had the authority, but the manner in which the government invoked that authority, the very, very dodgy logic of the government, the sweeping nature of that regulation under which the government tried to impose this ban. I think all of this was a bit of a wake-up call. And many of the fears that journalists, editors have had over the last 2 years, but I would say going back even further, that the media is coming under pressure, I think that led to certain stiffening of the spine, which we hadn't seen for quite a while. And journalists mobilized themselves, and the government finally had to back off in a sense that they agreed not to press the case further, and the matter is now in litigation. NDTV will press its case in the Supreme Court. But I think the fundamental fear that the government is intolerant of criticism and will use any and every method at its disposal to, in a way, get the press, get the media to report things the way the government sees. I think that fear remains, and I think we now are living in pretty dangerous times.
So speaking specifically about The Wire, how freely can you publish news that does question the government and its policies, and how does censorship work specifically for an online news platform? Okay, well,
there's no such thing as formal censorship. You are free to publish in this country. There's a constitutional guarantee of the freedom of the press, as it were. Not explicitly, but you read the freedom of the press through, the right of a citizen to liberty, free speech, information, etc., etc. But these freedoms or rights come with various caveats, and obviously the freedom of the press, you have to worry about defamation, criminal defamation, civil defamation. You have to worry about, the laws of the land, right? So it's not as if journalists are immune from or exempted from laws that apply to every other citizen, every other branch of society. Within that, I think there is no, a question of any censorship, as long as you stick to the tenets of the profession and report accurately, fairly, which unfortunately many people don't. But if you get a story, the kind of constraint that you face is, can you it may be an anti-government story, but can you verify it? What's the sourcing of the story? Like, often reporters come and say, we've heard this, we've heard that, such and such minister's up to something. But can you corroborate, right? Because journalism is much, much more than simply forwarding a cute video or a rumor that you get on WhatsApp, right? People expect from The Wire or from other responsible publications that there is an editorial vetting process, and that whether it's critical of the government or any other kind of news, really, that there would be some filtration process. So I think that's the main concern that we have, that when a reporter or a writer makes a certain claim or writes something, does it add up? Do the facts check out? Within that, if they do, then there's no question of being cowed down by the fear of what a minister may say or what a company may feel. Although these people are powerful and they have levers that they can exert, lawsuits can be filed, all kinds of other threats can be issued, but we haven't faced those kinds of problems as of now.
And you've been in this industry for a long time. Do you think with the change in government there's been more censorship, and what differences have you noticed in what you can say and what you can't say?
Yeah. As I said, there's no formal censorship, but what we've seen, which is in a way new with this government, is quite a few examples now of newspapers or TV channels running something and then pulling it back. Taking it off air or not running a certain story or removing it from the web edition of the paper. This, in the past, it's not as if the Congress was particularly tolerant of criticism, but they never went so far as to demand, not since the emergency tender rate, to demand that a story which appeared or an op-ed which was printed should not be there on the web. This government has gone a bit further. Again, you wouldn't find any explicit official order or rule. It's not as if some ministers picking up the phone, or that we have proof that a minister has picked up the phone or issued a letter. But there are ways of leaning on proprietors, and the proprietors then lean on an editor to ensure that something. So there is a sense I have that this government is particularly intolerant of negative publicity and criticism, is much more willing to use whatever levers it has at its disposal, and these are largely I would say not legal levers, because the government does not enjoy that much of legal authority to tell a newspaper what to run or what. At best, they can shut down advertising, right? But these are all pressure points that governments have. So this government is quite willing to use those pressure points to push coverage this way or that. And apart from these levers, let's not forget that we live in a highly competitive media environment where TV channels are falling over each other to get interviews with ministers and denying access to a channel because that channel reports you unfavorably, right? So that you can send a signal to a channel that, look, because of your coverage, we will make sure that no senior minister ever gives you an interview. So that becomes it's a form of pressure. It's not legal pressure. It's not censorship in the strict sense of the term, but you're looking at the media industry the way it works, and you've identified how it's vulnerable, and you figure out, okay, fine, this is what they follow each other to get interviews of ministers. Let's turn the tap off and see if they then will come to heel, and often it works.
Yeah. In response to the NDTV ban, it was said that it was done to protect public interest. So how do you deal with this ever-changing notion of public interest, because it is not a term that is clearly defined?
Well, public interest, I think at the end of the day, you can't have a neat definition of it, but if you see it, you know it. And I don't think that what drove the government, for example, let's go back to 26/11, right? Yeah. So the TV coverage of the terrorist attack on the Taj Hotel or Chabad House was pretty dreadful. I think everybody in the media acknowledges it. It was a complete free-for-all, partly because the government had no protocols, the police had no regulations, so you had crowds milling around, media milling around, and it was a bit of a media scrum. Subsequently, it emerged that some reports may have been used as inputs by the handlers of the terrorists who were watching these TV proceedings in Pakistan and conveying instructions to these guys, the bad guys, So the Supreme Court, expressed its anguish at this fact a few years ago, and in a way urged the government to do something about it. And a couple of years ago, the government introduced these new regulations. One of which, so essentially these are regulations which are layered into, they're part of the rules for the Cable TV Act. Essentially, your right to uplink and downlink is made conditional on you abiding by these rules. And one of the rules that they introduced, so there were the standard rules that you would find even, in the Constitution, that you can't incite violence and you shouldn't, things that are quite commonsensical. The new rule they introduced was that in the event of an ongoing terrorist strike, you will get your information only from a designated official spokesperson, and you will only report what that spokesperson says, and a few other things. Now, this is a sweeping kind of a statement, or a sweeping demand, because whether you look at Pathankot or any other kind of terrorist act, or also what constitutes a terrorist act. For example, when the Simi guys escaped from prison, right? So these were alleged terrorists, and they were on the run. So you could say, well, the fact that they've escaped and the police hunt for them is an ongoing terrorist activity. So, if somebody were to say that we should rely only on what the Madhya Pradesh police is saying, we wouldn't get the story, right? Because the Madhya Pradesh police fed a cock and bull account of what happened, which was subsequently exposed. But under the cable TV rules, everybody was breaking that law, right? So, I think public interest, as I said, you know it when you see it. And what the government did in the Pathankot case was not a correct invocation of public interest, because there is nothing that NDTV reported which other channels didn't report. More importantly, there's nothing that NDTV reported that the army itself was not saying in its press conferences. And we also know now that by the time this impugned piece to camera went on air, the actual incident was over, because there is still a dispute about whether there were 4 terrorists or 6, and received, most informed people say there were only 4. And we know that on the morning of that press conference which the NDTV guy reported, by then the 4 terrorists had been killed. So there was only dispute about whether there was somebody holed up in a particular building or not, and the army went and destroyed that building just by way of abundant caution. But it's not clear if there were actually terrorists there, right? So I think that the whole thing is rather murky, and in the media at least, we are pretty convinced that going after NDTV and going after it on very flimsy grounds is essentially some kind of a vendetta, which was triggered by the fact that this is one of the few Hindi channels that consistently does not toe the government's line. It's not a coincidence, right? Yeah. That this channel of all channels was singled out, and the label of being against public interest was pinned on this channel. And I think that the way the media responded as a whole was exemplary.
I just wanted to take a few questions from our studio audience. Would someone like to ask Mr. Varadarajan a question? Go right ahead.
So, you had a talk at the Allahabad University that got cancelled because of the ABVP, right? So, regarding that, regarding the cancellation, I want to ask you, what's your opinion on platform expression and non-platform expression of?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by platform and non-platform in the context.
Basically, when you went to the university, basically ABVP called you anti-nationalist, and so would you think it's a better option in this age to express your views and news, basically present the news on an online platform, or going out and
Okay.
No, well, also I think if I could just interject, this whole notion of no platforming is, we are not going to give X or Y a platform at the university because they represent views on abortion which are horrible, or sexist views, or whatever it is. So what do you think of this whole notion of not giving a platform, or not allowing somebody to have a platform?
No, I think it's deeply regrettable that people in the university would have this attitude, right? In the sense that whatever somebody's views, I would say, just like the ABVP in Allahabad was being intolerant, and also astonishingly inaccurate in the way they characterize my views, but in any case intolerant in saying that they will not allow me to speak or even enter campus, and no different from somebody who says that, well, we won't allow Subramanian Swamy to speak in Delhi University. The thing is that people have the right to protest, and I think it would have been fine for somebody to protest, demonstrate, as long as you don't disrupt, to even ask questions in a decorous manner. But to say that we will not allow somebody to speak and to use strong arm tactics is, I think, not acceptable. As far as I'm concerned, the invitation that was extended to me to speak there, it was actually from the Vice Chancellor of the university, who said that we would like to host you. I myself would chair the event, and it will take place in Senate Hall, which is the most prestigious kind of the big hall, big event venue for the university. And somewhere down the line, he must have got cold feet and cancelled the invitation. But I don't see it as an either or, right? So I write, so the Wire is the main platform, if you will, where I express my views, and where I get to practice the kind of journalism I believe in. But a lot of what one does is to actually, being a journalist also involves communicating with, being receptive to people's questions, going out in the public and explaining to people what you do, and also discussing the kind of questions that we're talking about today, which is that, how valuable for a democracy is the right to free speech? What's the status of press freedom in a country like India, and why ordinary people ought to be concerned about this? Increasingly addressing these questions and finding different venues and platforms to do that is, I think, also part of the ecosystem, the media landscape. And I think journalists and editors are increasingly being called upon to address diverse audiences on different platforms. And I think it's important that we do that, because if our thesis is correct, that media freedom is under peril in some way, then we have a duty to spread the word as far and wide as possible. I was recently in Odisha. I've given talks on this in Bilaspur, in different places, and I think it's something very, very important for me to do, and for others like me to also do that.
What would you tell student journalists here?
Lots to tell, but I think the fact is that it's an exciting profession, and it's arguably one of the most important ones that you could think of doing. It's an exciting profession to get into. A lot of what you hear that is wrong about the media is unfortunately mostly correct. So, but the message would be not to be disheartened, because there's still a lot that journalists can do, even within an organization that has its constraints. Right? So if you look at a certain TV channel or a certain newspaper, from the outside, it doesn't look like a place you necessarily want to work in. Once you get there, you find that it's not so simple for a proprietor or editor to lay down the line and have everybody follow it. Right? So there are lots of spaces for people to do things. Media houses are large organizations. There are lots of moving parts, and the potential to learn and to use your position to do something of value is always there. So I would say that you should be aware of what's happening in the industry and in the profession, but not be discouraged by it, because at the end of the day, it's important to use journalism to give information to people, to provide a platform for discussion and dialogue. And at the end of the day, given the way technology has evolved, you don't necessarily need to be wedded to a media organization, let alone a large media organization, in order to perform a role as a journalist. I mean, the number of freelancers and the number of individuals or small collectives that we encounter, they're a great boon for an organization like The Wire, where we don't have a budget to have a large staff, staff reporters, but we rely on this wonderful, large, thriving ecosystem of freelance journalists who, for a variety of reasons, decide to strike out on their own, and they operate pretty much in every part of the country, doing the kind of stories that the big media isn't doing. So I would say, you've chosen the right line, and develop all the skills that you can, and then get out there.
We have time for one last quick question.
We've spoken about freedom of expression being under threat. We were just wondering, is there any body that protects the rights of journalists who do put out media that is probably not so well accepted?
No, sadly there isn't. I mean, there's the Press Council of India, which is largely a toothless body. There's the Editors Guild, which has increasingly found an important voice for itself, but it's at the end of the day an NGO, right? It's just a voluntary association of editors whose writ does not run over any government. And the kind of threats that we've seen journalists in Chhattisgarh or Kashmir face, or the Northeast, physical threats actually, are the kind that require the law and order, authorities to take it seriously. It requires the courts to be involved. But sadly, despite journalists' organizations making noise about it, and even internationally, the Committee for Protection of Journalists or other forums, other associations have spoken about these things. But I haven't seen much change on the ground in terms of the kind of threats that individual journalists face. So this remains a profession that may perhaps, get increasingly dangerous. And as we can see around the world, even things like covering conflict, which at one point, there were rules of the game. Like 30 or 40 years ago, you could be a journalist covering, say, the civil war in Nigeria or the Arab-Israeli conflict. Chances are that unless you ended up inadvertently in harm's way, you would not be targeted for being a journalist. Today, journalists entering certain conflict zones know before they set foot that chances are that one side or the other will target them deliberately, right? So it's become more dangerous, and I think that it's important that all of you be aware of the dangers that are involved, and you shouldn't have illusions that everything will be safe and that there'll be somebody out there to protect you. Often you're on your own. But I do wish, and I do feel that there ought to be organizations and codes of conduct that that ensure that the ability of a journalist to accurately report whatever she sees, and freedom for her to go wherever she wants, that ought to be guaranteed as an integral part of municipal or domestic law as well as international law, that there should be international institutional support to ensure that this right is guaranteed.
And I think Akash Meg had one last question, so I'll ask you to ask it.
Just one question in the sense, I feel that it's kind of unfair to say that this government is more intolerant towards towards press or even the freedom of press. Because if you look at the kind of criticism that the Prime Minister is facing with respect to demonetization, or perhaps the Mohammed Akhlaq case, or perhaps even most of the bigger issues, or perhaps I understand the issues of on the peripheries of India, perhaps, when you said Kashmir and Chhattisgarh. So those have been issues that have been not just in this government, but before this government also. So these are continuing issues with respect to freedom of press. So, but if I'm going to take these cases out, I would say freedom of press has still been pretty much, an assessment would be that it has not changed as much.
Right.
So, what do you, what's your...
No, see, the thing is that freedom of there's no restriction on somebody's ability to cover things, right? But the attitude of the government is very hostile. Like, we had minister after minister, you mentioned demonetization, for example, right? So the framing of demonetization as a great patriotic act presupposes that those who criticize it, and you've had ministers say so in so many words, that it's anti-national to question this. The Prime Minister himself, not in relation to the media, we know he has a very low opinion of the media, but in relation to the opposition, which is an integral part of a parliamentary system, he says the reason you want a debate and you're questioning demonetization is because you have black money yourselves. Right? So the lowering of public discourse to this level, where and this is an extreme form of if you're not with us, you're against us. It vitiates the atmosphere, and in a situation where many media houses are economically vulnerable, where many of these guys have secondary or tertiary businesses which are subject to government regulations, rules, contracts, etc., etc. The fact is that it does have a chilling effect, and the willingness of proprietors to allow full freedom of expression and to allow the deployment of editorial resources or investigative resources to cover stories. I can give you examples of channels that have gone out of their way to cover demonetization, to find people when they interview them who are going to talk in favor of the government. Journalists have been instructed. There's a lot of this that is happening out there, which in the 20 years that I've been in the profession, I've never heard of this kind of attempt by proprietors, and one can only imagine that the proprietors are doing this. They're doing this in response to an official culture. I have never seen this kind of official culture. 5, 10, not during Vajpayee's time, not during Manmohan's time, not during Devegowda's time. This is something that's really quite unique and quite chilling. I don't want to exaggerate either. So it's not as if there's somebody over my shoulder saying "Ye mat likho, ye likho," but there is a chilling effect, and its effects are visible all around us.
I think we've got to bring this session to a close. So thank you very much, Siddharth, for coming in, inaugurating the studio and talking to the students. Thank you, Anushka, and thank you, Shranya, and good evening to all of you.
It's a pleasure to be here.